So, in the last segment of this lecture, we looked at the multilayer perceptrons, we looked at the learning algorithm, the back propagation algorithm. We saw how perceptrons could only solve linearly separable classes, whereas multilayer perceptrons are free from that kind of a shortcoming. They have this universal approximation property, they can learn practically any real world function. So, in this segment we will see how these multilayer perceptrons can be applied to problems in psychology and also neuroscience. So, specifically we will look at 5 phenomena. So, these are like past tense learning, that tells you how children learn past tense. Then net talk refers to how a network can be taught to read text aloud. Third one refers to the phenomenon of object permanence and how children learn this concept of object permanence. The fourth one is about balance, how children learn the concept of balance, and fifth one is a network model called convolutional neural network. Out of these 5 phenomena, the first 4 refer to more psychology, particularly phenomenon 1, 3 and 4 are from child psychology. The second is a behavioral task, and fifth one can be related to neuroscience, and it can be taken compared to certain phenomena that are observed in the visual system of the brain. So, first 1, 3 and 4 come from child psychology. A lot of pioneering work in child psychology was done by Jean Piaget, who was a Swiss psychologist, and Piaget's main philosophy is that when children learn in various domains like cognitive, motor and so on, their learning progresses in distinct stages, and his work was later taken up in the 60s and became very popular in the 60s. It was kind of rediscovered in 60s by many other psychologists, and who developed these ideas further and have delineated these stages that were described by Piaget. So, in the 80s when connectionist evolution has taken place, people have applied the kind of neural network models that we are studying to some of the phenomena that Piaget and others have studied, and have shown how these networks can explain some of the stages that Piaget and others have studied. So, among these examples, the first example we will see is past tense learning, that is, how do children learn past tense. Now, learning past tense in English is actually non-trivial if you really haven't thought about it much. So, because in past tense there are 2 kinds of forms. So, there are these regular verbs, for example, you have generate and generated, you have severe and severed, or love and loved, and so on and so forth. So, in kind of a regular past tense form, you simply add either d or ed to the verb. Then lot of other examples of past tense do not fall under this general pattern. These are called the irregulars. So, for example, put and put, come and came, and give and gave, and so on and so forth. So, past tenses come in 2 forms, regular and irregular. Now, as children learn past tense of English verbs, it has been found that they exhibit 3 stages. So, in stage 1, children are exposed to only a small number of verbs, their vocabulary is very limited. So, they have some high frequency words which are mostly irregular, and these they learn very quickly. And then there is a small number of words which are regular. So, for example, come and came, and get and got, and give and gave, look, looked, need, needed, take, took, and go and went. So, children almost memorize these mappings between the present tense form and the past tense form, and they learn these things very quickly. Then comes stage 2, where they are exposed to much larger stock of words, and it turns out that a majority of the words that they are exposed to in second stage are regular. So, for example, wipe and wiped, and pull and pulled. So, they have this standard d or ed ending. So, children begin to learn this rule, this new rule, this pattern that underlies a lot of past tense forms, but then they also start making mistakes on verbs that they have learned before in stage 1. So, they begin to wrongly apply this past tense rule of d or ed ending to verbs which they have learned in the previous stage. So, for example, for come they might wrongly use the past tense of comed or came. But when they go to stage 3, then the error of stage 2 is corrected because you have large number of both regular and irregular forms are encountered by children in stage 3, and now they have acquired the use of correct irregular form of past tense, but they also continue to apply the correct regular form to the new words that they learn. Now, a network can be trained, and people have shown that the network also exhibits all these 3 stages as the network is trained. So, to do this experiment, they have used they train the network in 3 different stages. In stage 1, as a small number of high frequency verbs were used for training. There are only 10 of them, and among them 8 are irregular forms, 2 are regular forms. The words are like come, get, give, look, and so on and so forth. Then in the second stage, they used 410 medium frequency verbs. Among them 334 are regular forms and 76 are irregular forms. And the last stage, they use 86 low frequency words. Among them 72 are regular and 14 are irregular. So, how do you train the network? In stage 1, 10 epochs of high frequency verbs were used. So, epoch consists of one presentation of the entire set of patterns or verbs. So, with 10 epochs, the network is able to learn the correct past tense form for all these words. In stage 2, 410 medium frequency verbs were added to the first set of 10 verbs, and this was trained. This stage went on for 190 more epochs after phase 2, that is up to 200 epochs. So, in this stage suddenly the errors started creeping in. The network started making mistakes on the irregular verbs and started regularizing them. That is, it started giving supplying wrongly the ed or d ending to some of the irregular verbs in this stage. Then stage 3, 86 low frequency verbs were tested without training, and beyond stage 2, the performance of regular and irregulars is nearly the same, each touching 100%. That is, once you go beyond 200, right, the performance on both regulars and irregulars tended to be the same. So, in this graph you can see the network's performance. There are two graphs within this plot. One graph shows the performance on regular verbs and second on the irregular verbs. So, up to 10 epochs, so network showed same performance on both regular and irregulars, right, and beyond that, when the new set of words are added in stage 2, it suddenly started making a lot of errors on the irregular verbs, and that is because it was wrongly supplying the regular ending d or ed to all the irregular verbs. But as training progressed and up to 200, by this time the performance on regular and irregular became almost similar. So, you see this general pattern of of learning past tense that is displayed by the network, and which is very similar to how children learn past tense and how the kind of mistakes they make at various stages as they learn past tense. So, interestingly, this network that was used for this study is not even a multilayer perceptron, it is only a perceptron, that is, there are no hidden layers. So, what is interesting here is even a simple network like that can be used to capture some of the patterns of learning that are displayed by real humans. The second study we will talk about is what is called net talk. This is a neural network that can read text aloud, and although it is a very simple network model, some of its learning patterns can be matched to some of the learning patterns that you see in real humans. This study is performed by Sejnowski and Rosenberg in a paper published in 1986. So, the net talk is basically a system that can read English text aloud, so it can pronounce letters accurately based on context. Okay, so pronunciation, particularly in English, is a bit of a challenge, because pronunciation of the mapping between the character and sound is non-unique. It depends on the context, because English is not a phonetic language, it is a alphabetical language and not an alpha-syllabic language. For example, Indian languages are alpha-syllabic. There is a much more unique mapping between character and its pronunciation, whereas in English, pronunciation of a character depends a lot on the context. So, for example, C is pronounced as k in cat and as s in facade, or if you look at the letters A, B, E, that letter string is pronounced as ave as in gave or brave, but as have as in have, right. Similarly, the letters E, A are pronounced as E or as in read, or E as in read. Okay, so there is a lot of difference from context to context. So, therefore, if you want to train a network to read, you cannot give single letters as input and expect the network to reproduce the correct pronunciation of the phoneme. You have to give a certain context of that letter. So, how do you give a context? So, the simplest way is, in addition to giving the letter, you should also give certain neighboring letters. So, that will set the context for that letter. So, this picture shows the architecture of the network. So, you have the input layer, a hidden layer and output layer. So, in the input layer you give at any given time 6 characters. So, you have a running string of the text. So, you take a window of 7 characters, and then there is central character is what you are interested in. You are trying to predict the pronunciation or the corresponding phoneme for the central character. So, in addition to the central character you give 3 characters on the right, 3 characters on the left. So, these 6 characters form the context of the central character. So, this window of input of text is given as input to the input layer, and which is presented to the hidden layer, and then that is presented to the output layer where the phoneme is recognized. So, there are and each input character is represented by a set of 29 bits, because the network can understand all the 26 English letters and 3 punctuation, that is full stop, comma and a blank space. So, at any given point there are 29 characters or symbols that are possible. So, therefore, the character is represented as a 29 dimensional binary vector with the corresponding bit set to 1 and all the other bits set to 0, right. And then there are 7 input characters. So, the inputs consists of totally 29 times 7, right, a matrix of 29 by 7. There are 80 hidden neurons and 26 output neurons, and these 26 outputs code for a phoneme. So, for example, each of the output neurons code for some property of a phoneme. For example, is it a plosive, or is it a fricative, or is it a labial kind of sound. For example, p, p, b, all these are labials, right, or are these dentals, and so on and so forth. So, these properties of the phonemes are coded in this 26 dimensional vector as output, and the network is trained to map the pronunciation, the corresponding phoneme of the central character onto the output phoneme. Now, one question is, why is the context of 7 chosen, why not 17 or why not 3 and so on. Okay, so, how do you define a context, right? So, if you take more a bunch of characters beyond the central character, what we should be considering is, do the other characters convey some information about the sound of the central character, that is, how far can you go before this far off character does not provide any information about the pronunciation of the central character. So, here the authors of this study used a concept called mutual information. So, mutual information tells you with what probability you can predict a certain variable x, right, if you had knowledge of another variable y. Okay, so, when they calculated the mutual information between the central character and any other character in the window, so they found that when you go to a window size of more than 3, right, on one side, right, the mutual information falls to very low values like about 0.1. So, beyond that the characters do not convey any information about the pronunciation of the central character. So, therefore, they have taken a window size of 7. Now, the data that they have taken for training the network, they have taken from a dictionary having about 20,000 words, and among them 1,000 words were chosen. These are very high frequency words as were specified in this brown corpus of most frequent English words. And then these words were mapped onto continuous speech, which was annotated. This was a speech taken from speech of a child, and the way characters are mapped onto phonemes are like this. Suppose you have the word phone, right, the first syllable is f, right, then both p and h together are mapped onto the phoneme f, and then there is space, then o, the letter o is mapped onto phoneme o, and letter n, the letter sequence n, e are mapped onto the phoneme n. Okay, so, wherever there is a missing character, in the output there is no phoneme, and there is just a missing space. So, as they train the network on this data, what they found is, so the performance of the network gradually increases, and it shows an exponential kind of behavior, that is, it rises quickly in the initially and then flattens out after some time. So, here the learning behavior of the network is strongly similar to human skill learning. So, when humans learn a new skill, right, they learn very quickly in the early stages, and after that slowly the performance saturates or flattens out. Okay, and in addition to the phoneme accuracy, they also looked at stresses. I mean, the network also tried to predict stresses, and network is able to predict stresses more accurately than it predicted phonemes. Now, they also compared the performance of a perceptron with a multilayer perceptron. So, that is when the network had no hidden neurons, so that is a perceptron. Network learnt very fast initially, but flattened out very quickly and sort of saturated at a very low level of performance. as you can see in a couple of these curves. So, in some of these curves 0 means it is a perceptron. So, number of hidden neurons is 0, and as they kept increasing the number of hidden neurons, the performance kept on increasing. Then stages of learning. So, what is interesting is, as a network kept on learning, so the output of the network, which is a phoneme sequence, was given to a speech synthesizer, a standard commercial speech synthesizer, so that you can listen to what the network is producing as output. And the pattern of speech that is generated is very similar to how children learn to speak, which is very interesting, because the network is very simple. We really did not incorporate anything about the speech production systems in the brain or anything like that. So, one of the first things that the network has learned is distinction between vowels and consonants. So, first of all, the network was never told that certain characters are vowels and certain characters are consonants. It was just given a continuous string of letters on the input side and a continuous string of phonemes on the output side. But when in the earlier stages, when the network produced these words, it looked as if it is babbling. So, for example, it would map all the consonants onto one consonant, again all the vowels onto one vowel. So, it would produce something like ba 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 ba, papa papa, and so on. And that is interesting, because these are the kinds of sounds that in children at a very early stage, when they are just learning to speak, right, are most comfortable with. So, therefore, even the family members are often given names which are like results of babbling or productions of babbling, like mama and papa and kaka and so on. So, network also makes these kinds of sound, which is interesting. Next, the network learned to pause at word boundaries. So, initially it was producing these continuous strings of sounds, whereas after some learning, after some training, network learned to pause at word boundaries, and word boundaries are denoted by blank spaces, right. So, it looked as if the network is producing random words or pseudo words, right, when a word is given, but it had learned to pause between those pseudo words. After about 10 passes, the network's speech was understandable. You could make sense out of what the network is saying, right, and this looks a lot like how children would learn to speak. And the error patterns that are exhibited by the network are also quite meaningful. For example, if the word thesis is given, network output might go something like these, which is very close to thesis, and it also rarely confuses between vowels and consonants. So, it is very clear that it is distinguishing vowels and consonants. In a separate study, it was also verified that some neurons in this network, in the hidden layer, some neurons respond specifically to vowels and some neurons specifically to consonants. So, the network automatically had learned that consonants and vowels are two different classes of sounds, and it has learned to distinguish these two classes very clearly. Also, what is interesting is some of the errors that the network made are not really errors by the network, but these were actually errors in the annotation. So, in the training set there were mistakes, and that actually seemed to make it look that network had made the mistake, but actually network was correct, and the network's output had pointed out the errors in the annotation. So, for test performance, the network was tested on 439 words from regular speech, and these were not present in the training set, and performance was 78%, which is pretty good. So, what that showed is that network can generalize from one set of words to another. Now, the researchers also studied what happens when you damage the network. So, when you damage the network, so this was done by adding noise to the weights, right, and so if you can, there are two curves in this graph. So, the top one is the best case, what is called the best case, and the bottom one is called the perfect match. So, basically when the network produces output, this is a 26 dimensional output, which corresponds to the properties of the phoneme. So, when the output exactly matches the correct properties, that is what is called the perfect match, right. In other cases, what they have done is to see which is the phoneme vector which matches the actual output of the network best, and that is what is called the best case. So, best case performance is obviously better than the perfect match performance, and also the best case performance turns out to be more robust to damage than the perfect match, because in the best case performance, when you added a noise up to 0.5, performance did not change, that is, network is very robust to damage. So, one more aspect of damage which is very interesting is that how does the network relearn after damage, how does it recover from damage. So, in this study they have taken a network, they have added some noise and sort of damaged the network by adding noise, and in the damaged network now has a performance of about 67%. Now you can see in the previous graphs that network performance goes all the way to 95-96% on the training set. So they have added noise so that the performance degrades up to 67%. Now, so there are two curves here, one corresponds to original learning and the other corresponds to relearning after damage. So original curve, learning curve basically tells you how the network has learnt beyond 67% originally. The other curve, relearning after damage, tells you how the learning proceeded once you have started retraining the damaged network. So you can clearly see that network has learned much faster than the original network when you train the damaged network. So this kind of a study is interesting and shed some light on how people learn after, say, a kind of a brain disorder or a brain accident like cerebral stroke. So stroke is a disorder of it's a neurovascular accident where because of loss of blood supply certain part of the brain can get damaged. Now once the stroke occurs, the patient is put through a lot of physiotherapy, cognitive therapy and so on, the kind of therapy that is appropriate for the kind of stroke that they have. And it turns out that when the stroke is not too extensive, the patients recover much faster, right, relearn that task or that function much faster than what they would have taken, right, in the beginning when they have learned that task as a child. So the network's behavior also reflects some of these phenomena from clinical neuroscience. Then it's also been observed from these studies that the network learns different sounds at different rates. So for example, C has the character C can be mapped onto two different phonemes. C is pronounced as sir as in nice, so this is called a soft C, and C is pronounced as k as in cat, this is called hard C. And it turns out that soft C takes longer than hard C, and that is what the network has shown, and that is because hard C occurs about twice as often as soft C in the data set. Interestingly, children also show a similar difficulty in learning, similar pattern of learning when it comes to pronouncing C. So in summary, we have seen that the early stages of learning, the pattern of speech that the network has produced is very similar to that of children. In fact, in the original paper, it was observed that the sounds produced were uncannily similar to early speech sounds in children. The patterns of errors produced by the damaged network are also similar to reading errors of individuals with acquired dyslexia. Dyslexia refers to difficulty in learning and reading. So the kind of an errors that individuals with dyslexia showed is very similar to the performance of damaged network. But to produce human intonation and prosody, that is kind of the variation pitch that you see as you utter a whole sentence, right, for that you need much longer context than the 7 characters. You should have an idea of the structure of the entire sentence to be able to produce prosody. So that needs a different kind of network architecture. So the next phenomenon we will be studying is learning object permanence. Okay, so before we talk about object permanence, let us discuss what are objects. So in fact, let us ask the question, right, what do we do with the sensory input? So with the eyes we look at the visual world, with the ears we look at we receive the sounds from the surrounding world, and we can touch and feel the world through our touch sensors, through skin. Now when we receive all this information, what we are doing with all the sensory input that's streaming in is to extract knowledge of abstract concepts. So we don't look at the world as abstracts, blotches of color which don't have any labels. Right, very quickly we map these blotches of color and form onto certain distinct objects. So I don't think that this kind of a red blotch that I see on the right is just a patch of color, but it's actually a person who is wearing maybe a red shirt. So similarly, this yellow blotch that I see on my left is not just a yellow patch of color, but it's a yellow wall, an object. So by analyzing the sensory input, right, we are carving out objects and we give them certain labels. So the need to carve out objects is that objects are more permanent, they are more lasting, they represent certain invariance, right, in all the variation and uncertainty that you see in the world outside. So one aspect of objects is there is object permanence, that is the understanding that objects exist even though you cannot see them directly. So, for example, if you are watching somebody walking and somebody just walks behind a tree, obviously you do not think that the person has suddenly disappeared. The person is there, but just behind the tree, and you do not think that person is gone somewhere, and for any moment the person might emerge back from behind the tree. So, this notion of that objects exist even though when they are not observed directly, right, it is called object permanence, and infants do not have it at a very early stage, and only around 9 months right in infants show this proof of object permanence. So, for example, if you take an infant who is lesser than 9 months, right, the infant might reach out to an object which is visible, but if you hide the object under a carpet or something like that, the infant will not go for it. But after 9 months, right, even if you hide the object under the carpet, right, the infant might try to struggle to go under the carpet and pick up the object. So, in fact, when mothers play these simple games with their babies, what they are testing or what they are maybe triggering in the minds of the infants is this perception of object permanence. So, very young infants, maybe less than 4 months, they do not understand this game. So, in this game, the peekaboo game, the mother tries to cover her face momentarily and then uncover her face again. So, when the baby understands that the face exists even though the face is covered, right, the face shows feelings of happiness or surprise, right, and so in this game basically the infant is revealing the ability to recognize object permanence. But it has been found that there are two kinds of object permanence. So, say the earliest work on object permanence was done by Piaget, like I mentioned, he is a child psychologist, a Swiss child psychologist, and a lot of his early work was done on his own children when they were infants, and he noticed that so babies reach for hidden objects right when they are around 9 months, but before that they reach for only visible objects but not for hidden objects. But later on another scientist named Balergian, right, found a different kind of object permanence. He has found that babies express surprise when exposed to hidden objects, and this kind of object permanence can be observed even around 4 months. Okay, so at an early stage they simply show evidence of the capability to display object permanence, right, but by simply expressing surprise, but at a later stage they show the same proof of object permanence by actually reaching out to a hidden object. So, Balergian's experiment from his 1993 paper goes something like this. So, there is a little ramp, right, and there is a screen in front. So, the rectangle with dashed lines is a screen, and there is a truck that rolls down the ramp and rolls down and along the track, and as it rolls down the track it goes behind the screen momentarily and emerges from the other side of the screen. Now, sometimes the screen is lifted revealing the track. So, in the first set of trials which are called the habituation trials or habituation events, right, the truck rolls down the ramp and rolls along the track, goes behind the screen, emerges from the other side of the screen. Okay. So, now in some cases the experimenter places an object or an obstacle right behind the screen, and here again there are two sub cases. So, in one case which is called the possible event, the obstacle is placed behind the screen, but the obstacle does not block the track. So, as the truck rolls down the ramp and rolls along the track, the truck can roll forward behind the screen and emerge from the other side of the screen. Whereas, in the impossible event, right, the obstacle is placed right on the track, so that when the truck rolls down the ramp and rolls down the track, it gets blocked by the obstacle and cannot emerge from the other side of the screen. So, now what we are looking for is the understanding that in the possible events the truck can emerge from the other side of the screen, whereas in the impossible events the truck cannot emerge from the other side of the screen, because there is an obstacle blocking its path. So, when this experiment was performed with babies, what was observed is, on impossible trials the infants show surprise if the truck reappears beyond the screen, because it is not supposed to appear, because it is supposed to be blocked by the obstacle. Whereas, on possible trials they show surprise if it fails to reappear, because on possible trials the truck should be able to come out from behind the screen, because the obstacle is not blocking the path. Okay. So, this is what has been observed. So, the question now is, so we have seen that there are two kinds of object permanence, or the children or infants show their knowledge of object permanence in two ways. One is simply by surprise, and the second is by actually reaching out, which is what Piaget has found, and the second kind, which is by surprise, which is what Bellargion has found. Now, at 4 months, if infants show evidence for object permanence, they show surprise when their notion of object permanence is violated, whereas at 9 months infants show evidence of object permanence, right. They actually reach out to the hidden object, and that is the kind of object permanence that Piaget has discovered. But why is there this kind of a delay, and can we reproduce this kind of an effect using a computation model, using a neural network model? So, a connectionist model or a MLP kind of model of this phenomenon was developed by Maréchal in a paper published in 1995, right. So, the aim of this model is to see whether reaching for an occluded object will develop after reaching for a visible object, because that is what Piaget has found, right. Children or infants reach out for a visible object first, right. Only much later they evolve the concept of object permanence and reach out for an occluded object. So, the second question is to see whether the model could mimic an expectation about the reappearance of an obscure object, which can develop before the ability to reach for it. So, that is so the expectation here is the surprise that they have found in Bellargion's experiment. So, can this surprise or expectation, right, about an object, about an obscured object, can it emerge even before the ability to reach the object? So, to look at the network architecture, before we look at the network architecture, let us quickly look at some aspects of the visual system, how brain processes visual information. So, in this picture we see a kind of a simplified picture of the brain, side view of the brain, and you can see the eyes. And so, when you look at something, the image of that scene falls on the retina, as we all know, and retina then sends the image information in the form of electrical signals by a bundle of fibers called the optic nerve, and this information goes to one stage in the brain called the LGN, which you can see in this figure, and from LGN then it proceeds further and reaches a part of the occipital lobe, which is called the V1. This is also called the primary visual cortex. Then from V1 they have fibers which project to in two different directions. So, it goes to V2, which is the secondary visual cortex, and from V2 it goes to it diverges along two pathways. One pathway goes to another area called MT and so on into the parietal areas or into the superior parietal areas. This is called the parietal pathway or the dorsal pathway, because it is dorsal to the brain, and it is also called the where pathway because it is these parts of the brain which process where is the object that you are looking at. Then another stream begins from V1 and proceeds downwards via the ventral pathway, which is because it is a ventral part of the brain, and it goes into the temporal lobe, into the inferior temporal areas. This is called the what pathway because at the end of it, in these parts of the brain recognizes what is that object. Okay. So, and this is relevant to understanding the kind of architecture that is used to model object permanence. So, in this proposed model by Maréchal et al, the network architecture is shown in this figure. So, there is an input layer which is a two-dimensional array which represents the retina. So, the input is called a retina, which is an array of size 25/4, which looks something like this. So, what you see on the left is the input retina. Then and there are two hidden layers that you can see, and so from the input you proceed in one direction towards the right along the so called where pathway, and there you have again another array of size 25/4, and this is a visual memory layer, because here there is a feedback from layer to itself, that is this layer memorizes the state of the layer from the previous step, and that is used that is also projected to the next layer. Now, on the left side you have a layer which has 5 neurons, and these are object recognition neurons. Okay, so these neurons recognize what is the object, and the neurons on the other layer on the right side recognize where is the object. Now, the 25/4 visual memory units layer projects to another hidden layer of size 75 neurons, and this in turn projects to two output layers. There is one on the left which is 25/4 grid, and the one on the right is also 25/4 grid, but both these outputs represent different things. The outputs are different, they are trained to produce different outputs. Okay, so what are they, how is the network trained? Let us look at that. Okay, so the network on the right, so the output on the right is trained to predict the next position of the input object. So here in this image, so this little square, right, of size 2/2 is the object, and this bigger rectangle of size 3/4 is the occluding screen. So what you see in the left set of column of images is you see the object coming from the right, and it just enters and goes behind the screen, it completely goes behind the screen, and it stays like that for two steps, and then at t equal to 4 it just begins to emerge from behind the screen, and t equal to 5 it is completely out of the screen. So, so this is the input that is shown to the network, and the right output layer that you see here, so the output on the right side is supposed to predict the next position of the object. So, this is called trajectory prediction. So, next we look at a class of neural networks called the convolution neural networks. So, these networks are actually, you can think of them as special case of multilayer perceptrons. The only thing is the multilayer perceptrons are 3-layered networks that we have, most of them that we have seen are 3-layered networks, although the original theory can be extended to any number of layers. More specifically, the convolution network are a special case of multilayer networks, because in this case, in these networks all the layers are 2-dimensional layers. Okay, and the original convolutional networks were developed as an application to read handwritten numbers on postal envelopes, and this was done by a sponsored project by US Postal Service. It was done by a company called AT&T, and so in the convolutional network, so the architecture of the network looks like this. So I give an input which can be a character or an image of it's a visual pattern which is shown here. So each of the hidden layers consists of multiple 2-dimensional sublayers. So this is the orange stack that you see here is the first hidden layer. It consists of 4 sublayers, and that is each of these sublayers is a 2-dimensional array of neurons. So a neuron in any of these sublayers does not look at the entire input image, but looks at only a small window of that image. So similarly, if you go to the second hidden layer, where you see this blue stack of sublayers, and each of the sublayers is again a 2-dimensional array of neurons. A given neuron in this hidden layer again looks at only a small window of neurons in the previous layer, and so on and so forth. So then again the next layer you have another stack of 2-dimensional layers, and each neuron in these sublayers that also look at only a small window and not the complete array in the previous hidden layer. So at the end of it you have one array of single 1-dimensional array of neurons. So in this case, since we are trying to classify numerals from 0 to 1, right, the output will have only 10 neurons correspond to the 10 classes. Okay, so this shows a schematic of what happens when you give a sample image like, for example, 6, right. Each of these arrays show the response of the sublayer, right, at various hidden layers. Now, once the network is trained, for testing the network they have given very complicated cases. Like for example, when the network is trained, so the kind of patterns that they were given are standard numbers, like 2 is written like this, or 4 is written like this, and 6 is written like this. But for testing they have given all these complicated contrived cases where 2 is written as a ring, as a chain of lots of small rings, or the 4 is a kind of a hollow 4 because there is white space in the middle of the 4, and 6 is a hollow 6, but also it has lots of breaks in the outer contour, and so on and so forth. But in spite of all this gross distortion in the input, the network is able to identify the input accurately. So for example, there is a 3 which is written using small slashes, small strokes, and 5 which is written using lots of dots, and 8 is written as a combination of 2 circles, right. In all these cases the network is able to recognize the character correctly. So, this shows that network seems to generalize very well to complicated cases, just as humans would generalize. Let us look at one more example. The convolutional network in this case was trained to recognize faces, human faces. So, after training they went into the network and probed the response of neurons to find out what it is responding to. So, it turns out that neurons in the lower layers, right, since they can look at only a small part of the input image, right, they are actually responding to edges, right, and whereas if you go to neurons in the next hidden layer, neurons here are responding not to the entire face, but only to parts of face, like for example an eye or a nose, right, or a lip and so on. Whereas if you go to our next level, right, neurons here seem to be responding to entire faces, but not specific faces, they seem to be responding to whole classes of faces, right. Now, so this is very interesting because the network seems to break up the problem in very special ways. Now, is that what happens in the real visual system? So, let us look at some data from real visual system. So, as we have seen before, when you receive input from the eyes, the information goes to the first cortical stopover, which is the primary visual cortex called V1, right, and then it goes to V2, and then from there in the ventral pathway it goes to a region called IT or inferotemporal area, and this is where the complex objects are recognized, right. So, if you look at what neurons in different layers of the visual system represent, right. So, in the figure on the left you can see that V1 neurons represent or respond to only edges. So, these edges could be of any orientation. So, they respond to edges with orientation, whereas if you go to next level, say V2, right, you have neurons which respond not just to edges, but combination of edges like angles or or even features where three lines could come together forming a trijunction. And as you go higher and higher, right, in different parts of the inferotemporal cortex like anterior inferotemporal or posterior inferotemporal, PIT or AIT, you have neurons which respond to a whole complex object. So, you see that more primitive features are represented in lower layers of the visual system, whereas if you go to higher and higher stages, more complex objects are represented, just like what we have seen, right, in an abstract network which is trained on faces. So, what we can learn from all these examples is that general multilayer networks which are not very faithful to the real world, real brain or real neurons, can reproduce many phenomena from psychology and neuroscience, and they exhibit several stages of learning, right, as what Piaget and others have observed in stages of learning in children. And these kinds of networks also model brain's architecture, and they model how brain's architecture can break up the problem of interest. So, in this case we have seen how the visual system breaks up a problem of recognizing complex objects, and we have also seen how networks with multiple layers, right, can also break up the problem of visual pattern recognition in very similar ways. But the network models that we have seen now are somewhat restricted, because real brain is obviously a lot more complicated. The models that we have seen so far are somewhat simplistic. For example, they do not have loops, whereas in real brain and the connectivity has lots of loops, and so we need to incorporate that. And the neuron models that we have seen also in these examples are too simple, right, and they do not capture real brain's dynamics. So, we need to consider more realistic models, which is what we will do in some of the future lectures. Thank you.